using scenarios, vignettes to explore sensitive topics in focus group discussions. Presented by Sylvia Frankowska-Tahari, AliCamp 2021. We'd like to thank our gold sponsors Telstra and Intopia, our silver sponsors ANZ and Coles, and our bronze sponsor How2.
Hello everyone, it's great to be here. My name is Sylvia Frankowska-Tahari and I'm an accessibility researcher. In this presentation, I'd like to talk about how to explore sensitive topics in group discussions. I'll begin with the existing definitions of a sensitive topic. Then I'll move on to discuss when UX studies can become sensitive. Next, I'll talk about the use of personas and scenarios as a research tool. And finally, I'll present an example of a study where I used personas and scenarios and what I've learned from this experience. So what is a sensitive topic? There are currently two popular approaches that try to explain what a sensitive topic is. The more traditional one says that a sensitive topic must discuss some intimate, personal matters or a discreditable, incriminating behavior or a taboo. So in essence, it claims that there are topics that are always sensitive and others that are not sensitive by nature. A more recent approach tells us, however, that any topic can become sensitive if it's likely to generate a threat to the people involved in the study. And this may be because the study explores, for example, people's private lives or extremely personal experiences, which to the participants may feel like an invasion of their privacy. It can also happen with studies that focus on what society considers to be inappropriate behavior, where participants may worry that if they admit to that behavior, they can get punished. It can also happen in studies that explore privileges that participants may currently enjoy, and they could worry that these privileges will be taken away from them as a consequence of the study. So if we go with the latter definition, we'll accept that any topic may become sensitive depending on the context and people involved in the study. But of course, there are topics that may be more likely to become sensitive. For example, issues related to gender, sexuality, ethnicity, violence, aging, health, and disability. So you may think it all sounds very interesting, but it's more like the sort of study that a social or health researcher would do. Why would a UX researcher need to worry about sensitive topics? I'd like to tell you about the studies that led me to think about sensitive topics in the first place. A while ago, I was involved in a user research of a dating app with people with disabilities. So in the sessions, participants completed a set of tasks and we managed to identify some interesting accessibility issues. When asked, most participants said they enjoyed using the app in the session and it was relatively easy for them to use it. But only after the sessions, some participants said that in real life they would really worry about using dating apps. They did not want their family members or friends to find out about them dating or have access to their personal information in the profiles, and they weren't sure how the app could effectively protect their privacy. I asked those participants if I could include this information in the report because it was such an important finding about privacy, confidentiality, sharing and viewing profiles and so on. And luckily they agreed. I felt really disappointed that this finding did not come out from the main session, but from a more sort of informal chat that could have been easily missed. And I really wanted to find a better way to discuss sensitive topics with participants without making them feel uncomfortable or upset, because sensitive topics are very difficult to talk about, especially with strangers. So fortunately, there is a method like that, and it's personas and scenarios that have been used in numerous studies related to health and social sciences. You may have come across personas and scenarios as a design tool. Here we're talking about using them as a research tool. So personas are fictional characters that represent a larger group of people in terms of their goals, motivations, and needs. Personas are not real people, but they are based on a thorough research with real people. Scenarios, also known as vignettes, make the personas alive. They add that context and situation in which the persona aims to accomplish their goals. And scenarios, just like personas, are developed through comprehensive analysis of research data. So here is an example of a study where I used personas and scenarios as a research tool. This is my current project. I'm a research fellow on the 80-20-30 project, which investigates how assistive technology can help people with disabilities improve the quality of their lives. And it focuses on two locations, Indonesia and Sierra Leone. In phase 1, we did a series of interviews and shadowing sessions to understand the issues that people with disabilities and assistive technology users struggled with in their daily lives. In Sierra Leone, we found that people with disabilities and AT users had no or very limited access to healthcare and health information. So we wanted to explore this more to be able to propose a practical intervention. However, we also found that there was a lot of stigma around disability and disability in connection with some health issues, especially HIV, sexually transmitted diseases, family planning and pregnancy. And these issues were not openly talked about. So that was a barrier for us researchers. We could not just go to the communities and ask people open questions around these health problems. So we used the data from the interviews and observations and developed a set of 6 personas and scenarios. Here is Kadiatu, one of the health personas. Kadiatu is a 21-year-old woman. She is visually impaired. She is pregnant with her first baby and her due date is approaching. Kadiatu lives in a small dilapidated house located near a drainage that often overflows. The dirty water stays around for days, which attracts mosquitoes and puts Kadiatu and her family at a greater risk of contracting malaria and other illnesses carried by biting insects. And the scenario goes on showing Kadiatu in a local clinic when she has no funds to pay for care and for fresh water and so on. The scenarios were presented as stories to participants. They were read out, and then participants were asked to comment on those stories to help them to think about the persona and their scenario and to feel for them. We followed up with a set of questions, and some of the questions are here. Could this situation happen to someone you know? What are the health issues of this persona? How do you think Kadiatu might be feeling in this situation? How do other community people talk about Kadiatu? What other challenges might this persona face that were not mentioned in the story? What support might they need that we did not mention in the story? What information would help this persona? And then we opened up for comments. Here are some examples of people's reactions to the personas and the scenarios. So, for example, for Kadiatu, somebody said, "What happened to Kadiatu is exactly what's happening in our community. I have been a witness to a situation where a woman in labor was crying for help during the late night hours." In reaction to another persona, someone said, "I'm a living example to Musa's story." And then, like Fodé, most of us buy drugs without prescription because we can't afford the consultation cost. And another one, "I also find it difficult, just like Binta. My movement largely depends on the support I can get from others." And the last one here is, "This is exactly what happens to us and our children every day." So we can see that people recognize themselves in the personas and in the stories, and they could relate to them. In case of Kadiatu's persona, we learned about how difficult it is for a disabled single mom to look after her child, how disabled young girls are often victims of sexual abuse, and that they are at a higher risk of contracting HIV. So using personas and scenarios enabled us researchers to explore sensitive topics and details that would have not been available to us if we had not used this method in this study. And using scenarios and fictitious characters added that necessary distance and allowed our participants to discuss these topics in the third person and without having to disclose or share any of their own personal or intimate stories if they did not want to. We also learned that personas did not have to be complete or super accurate. They were more like props inviting people to a discussion, to engage into a discussion with us. And people, through their responses, were completing the picture, or they were correcting the stories that we presented in the scenarios. Participants' responses often mirrored their own experiences. And we could see that some participants could speak freely about the potential challenges that the personas would face and they related to their own experiences as well. Participants could contribute to the discussions regardless of whether they had a first-hand experience of the scenarios presented, of the stories presented in the scenarios. For example, some people who had no disabilities but were carers of a disabled person could also, contribute their views and talk about the challenges that people with disabilities experience in their communities. So personas and scenarios are a very effective tool to explore sensitive topics with participants in a group discussion. However, as if with any method, there are a couple of things that you need to be aware of when implementing this method. So one of them is that participants tend to very quickly move between their own experiences and the experiences of the persona. So it's very important to keep track of what's their own experience and what's the experience of the persona. Some participants might feel tested and sort of think that there is an expected answer, and they will talk a lot about what the persona should do or should have done. The question is, what would you actually do rather than what should you do? And then finally, depending on the needs of your participants, you should also consider the design of the personas and scenarios themselves. Ours were stories read out to people because many of our participants could not read or write. Some of them could not see, so we could not rely on photos, but depending on your participants, you may think of presenting the personas and stories in a different format, maybe more visual, maybe as a picture story or some other format. So if you think this is something that is interesting to you, here is a list of references that you may find useful to follow up. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all in our Q&A session. Thank you. Bye.
AliCamp 2021